On the night of my 17th birthday, exactly 10 years ago, my mother slapped me twice, so hard that I tasted blood before I even realized I was crying. 20 minutes later, my father dragged a black trash bag stuffed with my clothes to the front lawn and told me I had exactly 300 seconds to disappear from his property. If you've ever been thrown away, like you were less valuable than the garbage in your own home, you already know what that silence feels like. And before I go further, if you believe family betrayal cuts deeper than anything else, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story is not about revenge the way you think it is. It's about what happens when the people who raised you gamble your entire life and don't realize you're still playing the long game. My name is Victoria Hale, and 10 years ago, I stopped being their daughter. But what they never knew was this. That night wasn't just the worst moment of my life. It was the beginning of theirs. The argument started over something stupid. It always does. My older sister, Cassandra Hale, 2 years older. Perfect grades, perfect smile, the kind of daughter who never got questioned, accused me of stealing $1,200 from her savings envelope. I didn't. I had exactly $0 to my name at the time. But Cassandra stood in the living room, holding an empty envelope, crying in that fragile way she had mastered since childhood. "You've always been jealous of me," she said, voice trembling just enough to sound believable. "You can't stand that Mom and Dad trust me more." That sentence did it. Not because it hurt, but because it was true. They did trust her more. Always had. I laughed, and that was my mistake. Because in our house, laughter from me was considered disrespect. My mother, Elaine Hale, walked over and slapped me before I could even open my mouth. "Apologize to your sister," she said coldly. I didn't. Instead, I said something I've been holding in for years. "Maybe you trust her because she lies better." The room froze. My father, Robert Hale, didn't shout. He never shouted. He just looked at me with the kind of disappointment that felt heavier than anger. Then he said quietly, "Get out, not go to your room, not leave for the night. Get out." I thought he was bluffing, until he walked to the garage, pulled out a trash bag, and started throwing my belongings into it like he was clearing clutter. Shoes, 2 hoodies, my school notebooks, even the cheap photo frame from my 10th birthday. I remember asking one question: "Are you really choosing her over me?" He didn't hesitate. "You chose this." That sentence burned into my memory because it wasn't true. But it became the story they told everyone, that I was rebellious, ungrateful, difficult. By the time I stepped onto the driveway with that trash bag in my hands, I had nowhere to go. No money, no car, no relatives willing to take me in. And the worst part? Cassandra was standing in the doorway, watching me, not crying anymore, not scared, just smiling. A small, satisfied smile that I didn't understand back then, but I would. Years later, that night, it was early October in Columbus, Ohio, already cold enough that my breath turned white in the air. I sat on the curb for nearly an hour, waiting, hoping, believing maybe they would come back outside and say this had gone too far. They didn't. Instead, at exactly 10:42 p.m., the porch light turned off. That was when it hit me. I wasn't being punished. I was being erased. And here's something I want to ask you, because I still think about it even now. What would you do at 16 years old if the only people who were supposed to protect you decided you were disposable? Would you beg? Would you forgive? Or would you remember every single detail and wait? Because I chose the last option. I didn't cry after that moment. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not even when I slept in a bus station for the first time in my life. Something inside me went completely quiet, like a switch had been flipped. And in that silence, one thought repeated over and over. One day, I will come back. Not to ask for anything. Not to explain. Just to see their faces when they realize they threw away the wrong daughter. But here's the part I didn't understand back then. The part that would take me nearly a decade to uncover. Cassandra didn't accuse me randomly. The missing $1,200 wasn't actually missing. And my parents' decision that night wasn't as impulsive as it looked. Years later, I would discover something hidden in an old bank record. A document dated 3 days before my birthday. A document with my name on it. and my father's signature. But on that October night, sitting on the cold pavement with nowhere to go, I had no idea that being thrown out of that house had already set a much bigger plan into motion, one that none of us could stop anymore. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I had exactly $7.42 in my pocket, one cracked phone at 19% battery, and a bus ticket I bought with coins that smelled like metal and regret. At 6:15 a.m., I made the coldest decision of my life. I threw away the last family photo I had, face down, into a gas station trash can without even looking at it. If you've ever had to cut yourself off emotionally just to survive, you know that moment when something inside you shuts off completely. And before I go further, tell me in the comments, do you believe people are born strong, or does betrayal force them to become strong? And if stories like this speak to you, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next changed the entire direction of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. I didn't cry when I left Columbus, not on the bus, not when I watched the city disappear behind gray highway fog. I just stared at the window and counted mile markers like they were checkpoints in a game I hadn't asked to play. At mile marker 52, my phone died. At mile marker 103, I realized something strange. I wasn't thinking about my parents anymore. I wasn't even thinking about Cassandra. I was thinking about numbers, specifically about that missing $1,200. Because here was the part that never made sense. Cassandra kept her savings in cash, but she had always bragged that she tracked every dollar in a spreadsheet, every birthday gift, every babysitting payment, every dollar from selling old clothes online. She was obsessed with control. So why would she suddenly claim the money disappeared? Without proof. The more I replayed that night in my head, the more something felt off. Not emotional, strategic. But at 17, survival was louder than suspicion. By the time the bus reached Dayton, Ohio, I had a plan. It wasn't a good plan. It wasn't even a safe plan. It was just the only one I had. I found a 24-hour diner near the station and walked in at 3:10 p.m., pretending confidence I absolutely did not feel. A waitress named Marlene Porter was wiping down the counter when I sat. She was in her 50s, sharp eyes, cigarette voice. She took one look at me and asked one question. You running from something or toward something? I surprised myself by answering honestly, both. She nodded like that was the most normal answer in the world. Then she slid a laminated application form across the counter. You can wash dishes. $9 an hour. Cash at the end of the week. Don't steal. Don't cause trouble. That was it. No interview. No pity. Just an opportunity. And that moment taught me something important. Strangers can show you more humanity in 5 minutes than family does in a lifetime. I worked my first shift that night, 10 hours straight. Hands in scalding water until my skin peeled. The kitchen smelled like grease and burnt coffee. But I didn't care, because for the first time since being thrown out, I felt something solid under my feet. Control. I slept in the storage room for the first 2 weeks, on flattened cardboard boxes, with the hum of refrigerators as my lullaby. It should have been miserable, but compared to the silence of being unwanted, it felt stable, predictable, safe. One night, around closing time, Marlene sat next to me while I was doing inventory. She didn't look at me when she spoke. People don't throw at their kids for one argument, she said quietly. I froze. She continued, they do it when something bigger is at stake. That sentence hit me like ice water. Because until that moment, I had framed everything as emotional. Favoritism, jealousy, family dysfunction. But what if it wasn't just that? What if there had been a reason? Not a good one, but a calculated one. I didn't answer her. Instead, I asked a question that had been growing inside me. Do you think parents can lie to protect themselves? She finally looked at me and said something that would echo in my mind for years. Parents lie more than anyone. They just call it protecting the family. That night, after everyone left, I went through my trash bag again, looking for anything I might have overlooked. Receipts, old mail, school papers. Most of it was useless. Until I found a folded envelope wedged between 2 textbooks. It had been opened already. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a bank statement. Not mine, my father's, dated 3 days before my birthday. I didn't understand what I was looking at first, but one line was circled in blue ink. A transfer, $15,000, moved from an account labeled Education Fund, V. Hale, to a private investment account under my father's name. I stared at that paper for a long time because suddenly the missing $1,200 made sense. It wasn't about Cassandra's money. It was about mine. And for the first time, I realized something chilling. They hadn't just thrown me out. They had needed me gone. Before I could ask questions, before I could notice what had already been taken from me, I folded the bank statement carefully and hid it in the lining of my backpack. That was the moment something changed inside me. Not anger, not grief, clarity. Because a single thought crystallized in my mind. They didn't just abandon me, they erased me. Financially. And that meant one thing. There was something much bigger tied to my name. Something worth stealing. But what I didn't know yet was that the $15,000 wasn't even the real secret. It was just the smallest piece of a much larger transfer. One that had happened months earlier. One that involved a legal document I had never seen. A document that would explain exactly why my sister smiled the night I was thrown out, and why my parents never once tried to contact me in the 10 years that followed. At exactly 2:03 a.m. on a freezing night that winter, when the temperature dropped to 11 degrees, I sat alone in the diner storage room and did something that would have terrified the girl I used to be. I memorized every single number on that bank statement, like it was a survival code. 14 digits, routing numbers, account suffixes. I repeated them over and over until I could recite them faster than my own birthday. Because by then, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. If my family had taken something from me on paper, the only way I would ever understand the truth was by learning the language of paper better than they did. And before I go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever realized too late that someone wasn't just hurting you emotionally, but strategically positioning you to lose something bigger? Tell me in the comments, because this next part, this is where survival quietly turns into preparation. For the first year after being thrown out, I lived in a rhythm so mechanical, it almost erased time. Wake up at 5:30 a.m., prep kitchen at 6, wash dishes until noon, study at the public library from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., second shift from 6 p.m. until midnight, sleep in the storage room, repeat. I didn't have the luxury of grieving. I didn't even have the luxury of wondering why my parents never called, because every hour was a transaction. Time for stability, energy for income, focus for escape. What I studied at the library wasn't random. I wasn't reading novels or self-help books. I was reading about banking systems, custodial accounts, trust funds, inheritance law. I didn't fully understand everything yet, but I understood enough to know one critical thing. An education fund in a minor's name cannot legally be transferred without documentation, and certainly not without the minor eventually being notified, unless there was a legal structure I didn't know about, a trust, a custodial investment vehicle, or a guardianship clause. That realization sat in my chest like a weight, because it meant something I hadn't wanted to believe. My parents hadn't just acted emotionally that night. They had acted legally, carefully, like people closing a financial file. About 9 months after I left home, something unexpected happened. I received a letter. It arrived at the diner because Marlene had allowed me to use the address for job applications. The envelope was plain white, no return address, just my name, printed neatly, Victoria Hale. My hands shook slightly when I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no greeting, no explanation. Just one sentence, typed in black ink. You should stop digging into things that don't belong to you anymore. And below it, no signature, just a printed number. $24,800. I stared at that number for a long time, because I had never seen that much money written anywhere connected to me. Not in my family's house, not in any documents, not in anything I'd ever known. It wasn't just a threat. It was a message that said someone knew I was asking questions. Someone knew there was something to hide, and someone wanted me to stop. I didn't show the letter to anyone, not even Marlene. Instead, I folded it carefully and placed it next to the bank statement inside my backpack lining. That was the second piece of evidence. And the moment it clicked, something cold settled into my mind. The $15,000 transfer wasn't the real theft. It was a fragment, a small withdrawal from something much larger, something that had once been legally connected to my name. That night, I didn't sleep. I went back to the library and started researching one specific number, $24,800. Because that wasn't random. It was too precise. And after hours of digging through financial aid records, trust structures, and settlement cases, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. That exact number appeared frequently in one type of legal case, wrongful death settlements involving minors. I remember sitting there, frozen, staring at the screen, because suddenly, a memory surfaced. A memory I hadn't thought about in years. When I was 6 years old, my biological grandfather, my mother's father, had died in a workplace accident at a manufacturing plant. There had been lawsuits, insurance negotiations, family arguments behind closed doors. I had never paid attention, because children don't think about money tied to death. But now, everything started aligning in a way that felt too precise to ignore. What if that settlement money had been placed in a trust under my name? And what if my parents had found a legal way to access it? By removing me from the equation? My heart was pounding so hard that I had to step outside the library just to breathe. Because if that was true, then being thrown out at 17 wasn't punishment. It was timing. Perfect timing. Right before I became old enough to legally request access to my own financial records. And the most chilling realization of all was this. Cassandra hadn't just accused me randomly. She had a believable reason to make sure I left without questioning anything. But there was one piece missing. One critical detail I still couldn't explain. Who sent that letter? Because it wasn't from my parents. They would never warn me. They would just ignore me, which meant there was someone else involved. Someone who knew about the money. Someone who had access to legal information. And someone who was watching closely enough to know I was starting to connect the dots. I didn't know it yet. But that unknown sender was the only person who had tried to stop what my family had done. And years later, that same person would become the key witness who would bring everything into the open. That back then, at 19 years old, standing outside a library at 3 a.m. with freezing air burning my lungs, I only knew one thing for sure. My family hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. They had profited from my disappearance. And somewhere in a locked legal file, there was a document proving exactly how they did it. On a humid July afternoon, when I was 20 years old, with exactly $3,216 saved in a checking account and 2 blistered hands from working double shifts, I walked into a small legal aid office and said something that made the receptionist stop typing mid-sentence. I told her calmly, without raising my voice, I believe my parents stole money legally tied to my name, and I think they did it by forcing me out before I turned 18. If you've ever tried to challenge someone who already rewrote the narrative about you, you know how impossible that moment feels. Before we go deeper, tell me this in the comments. Do you think truth always wins eventually? Or do some people get away with betrayal forever? Because at that point, I wasn't sure which answer I believed. The legal aid office sat on the 3rd floor of a gray building in Dayton, Ohio. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Everything. It wasn't the kind of place where powerful people went. It was where people like me went. People trying to fight systems designed to exhaust them. The receptionist asked me to fill out an intake form. Income: $1,250 per month. Assets: $3,216. Family contact: none. Reason for request: suspected financial misappropriation by legal guardians. I watched her eyes flicker when she read that last line, but she didn't comment. She simply said, "Wait here." 30 minutes later, a man in his late 40s stepped into the waiting area. "Victoria Hale?" he asked. His name was Daniel Mercer. Full name: Daniel Thomas Mercer. Volunteer attorney. Former probate specialist. His handshake was firm but careful, like he already knew this conversation would be fragile. We sat in a small consultation room. He let me talk without interrupting. I explained everything in precise detail. The night I was thrown out. The bank statement. The anonymous letter with the number $248,000. The possibility of a settlement trust tied to my grandfather's death. He didn't react emotionally. He just listened, and took notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked one question. Do you have proof that such a trust existed? I hesitated, because I didn't. Not directly. I only had patterns, numbers, suspicions. But then I remembered something. There were court cases after my grandfather died, I said slowly. Industrial accident, lawsuits. I remember hearing adults arguing about insurance payouts. Daniel nodded. That's a starting point, he said. He opened his laptop and began searching public records databases. The room fell quiet, except for the clicking of keys. Then, after about 10 minutes, he stopped, and his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. What? I asked. He turned the screen toward me. There it was. A case record dated 12 years earlier. Plaintiff, Hale Family Estate. Defendant, Mid-State Manufacturing Corporation. Settlement amount, confidential. But one line was publicly visible. Trust established for minor beneficiary, Victoria Ann Hale. My chest felt tight. Because seeing my full legal name attached to something like that made everything suddenly real. Not a theory. Not paranoia. A documented fact. Daniel spoke carefully. Based on the timeline, this trust would have been managed by your legal guardians, your parents, until you reach the age specified in the trust terms. What age? I asked. He clicked again, scanning. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. 21. Not 18, 21. Which meant something chilling. When I was thrown out at 16, there were still 5 years before I could legally access that money. 5 years, where my parents remained full legal controllers of the trust. 5 years, where they could potentially restructure it, transfer assets, or close it. I felt cold, despite the summer heat. Can they do that? I asked quietly. Daniel's answer was careful. They can't legally take the funds for personal use, he said. But there are mechanisms. Administrative fees, investment reallocations, certain legal petitions, especially if the beneficiary becomes unreachable. Unreachable, that word echoed, because that was exactly what had happened to me. I had been forced into a situation where I had no stable address, no legal representation, no way to monitor what they were doing. It hadn't just been abandonment. It had been isolation, strategic isolation. Daniel continued scrolling. Then he found something else. A court filing dated 6 months after I was thrown out. Petition submitted by Robert Hale. Request: modification of trust management due to beneficiary's voluntary estrangement and inability to maintain contact. My hands trembled. Because that wording was deliberate. It framed me as the one who left, the one who cut ties, not the child who had been expelled. I whispered. They built a legal narrative. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, he said. And courts often rely heavily on guardian testimony when a minor is absent. I sat there in silence, because for the first time, the full shape of what had happened began to emerge. My parents hadn't just reacted emotionally. They had created a legal pathway. Step 1. Remove me from the household. Step 2. Document me as estranged. Step 3. Petition for expanded control over the trust. Step 4. I swallowed. What happened to the money? I asked. Daniel hesitated. Then he said quietly, that part isn't visible in public records, which meant there were sealed filings, private financial disclosures, documents I couldn't access without legal standing. And obtaining that standing would take time, years, possibly, unless there was evidence of misconduct, clear proof. A paper trail showing funds had been misused. Daniel closed his laptop. This will not be quick, he said, and it will not be easy. You're essentially challenging actions that occurred while you were legally a minor. I nodded, because I already knew that. But what I didn't say out loud was this. I wasn't trying to win quickly. I was trying to understand completely, because once I knew everything, I would decide exactly what to do next. Before I left the office that day, Daniel gave me one piece of advice. Do not confront them yet, he said. Not until we know where the money went. I agreed. But as I stepped back into the hot July air, a thought kept circling in my mind. A quiet, dangerous thought. If my parents had gone through that much effort to control the trust, then the amount inside it must have been far larger than $248,000. And somewhere, hidden behind sealed court documents, was the exact number. The number that explained why they had been willing to lose a daughter to keep it. 3 months after that meeting, on an overcast morning in late October, I sat in a cramped library cubicle with exactly $4,902 in savings and made a decision that would shape the next decade of my life. I stopped trying to recover the past and started planning how to control the future. Because by then, I understood something brutal but freeing. Even if my parents had stolen everything legally tied to my name, I could not rebuild power by chasing what they took. I could only build something they could never touch. And before we go further, let me ask you this. If someone stole your future once, would you spend your life trying to get it back? Or would you create a future so large they couldn't ignore it? Tell me in the comments, because this is where the story stops being about loss and starts becoming about strategy. Daniel Mercer and I met every few weeks after that first consultation. He explained the legal reality in careful, unemotional terms. The trust records were sealed. Access would require either proof of financial misconduct or evidence that my parents had falsified court statements. Without that, the case could take years and cost tens of thousands of dollars. Money I didn't have. And that's when he said something that shifted my entire perspective. Victoria, he told me one afternoon, sometimes the strongest legal position isn't built by fighting immediately. It's built by becoming impossible to ignore. I knew exactly what he meant. Credibility, financial independence, documentation, power. Because courts listen differently when a person is no longer vulnerable. That day, I stopped thinking like a victim and started thinking like an investor. I took every extra shift the diner offered. I stopped buying anything unnecessary. No new clothes. No entertainment. No spending beyond basic survival. Within a year, I had saved $12,000. That was the first time in my life I had ever seen 5 digits in an account under my own control. But money alone wasn't enough. I needed knowledge, not just about law, about markets, because one thing still haunted me. The fact that my parents had been able to manipulate finances in ways I didn't fully understand. I refused to remain ignorant, so I enrolled in night classes at a community college in Dayton. Major, Business Administration. Focus, Finance and Investment Structures. I studied like my survival depended on it, because in a way, it did. While other students worried about grades, I worried about leverage ratios, trust management laws, and asset protection frameworks. Every concept I learned felt like unlocking a piece of a system that had once been used against me. And slowly, something surprising happened. I became good at it. Very good. By the time I turned 22, I wasn't just passing classes. I was tutoring other students, and my professors began recommending me for internships. One of those recommendations changed everything. In my 3rd year, a professor connected me with a small investment firm in Cincinnati called Redbridge Capital Advisors. It wasn't glamorous. They managed portfolios for middle-income families, retirement accounts, small trusts, education funds. But for me, it was perfect, because I wasn't interested in prestige. I was interested in learning how money moved quietly behind legal structures. I started as an unpaid intern, filing documents, organizing client statements, entering transaction data. But I paid attention to everything, especially trust management procedures, because I knew one day I would need to understand exactly how my parents had done what they did. 6 months into the internship, something unexpected happened. One of the junior analysts quit suddenly, and the firm needed someone to handle basic portfolio tracking. They offered me the role part-time, $18 an hour. To me, it felt like a door opening, not emotionally, strategically. For the first time, I was sitting inside the system instead of outside it. And that's when I saw something that chilled me. Not directly connected to my family, but connected to the pattern. A trust account belonging to another minor, managed by guardians. The guardians had submitted multiple petitions to modify investment allocations. Each petition reduced long-term holdings and increased short-term administrative liquidity. In plain terms, they were slowly draining the trust under legally acceptable justifications. It wasn't theft. Not technically, it was erosion. legal erosion. And that was when the final piece clicked in my mind. That was exactly what my parents must have done. Not stolen everything at once, but gradually restructured the trust until little remained. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me focused. Because now I knew. If I ever wanted to confront them, I would need more than emotional truth. I would need financial proof. Years passed. My savings grew. My career advanced. By 25, I had become a full-time portfolio analyst. By 27, I had moved to Chicago and joined a larger firm. And by 29, I had something I never imagined when I slept in that diner storage room. 7 figures in managed assets, clients who trusted my judgment, and access to financial networks powerful enough to uncover almost any paper trail. But there was still one thing missing. One document. The final record showing exactly how much money had originally been placed in my trust. Because without that number, I still didn't know the full scale of what had been taken. And then, one afternoon, nearly 10 years after I was thrown out, Daniel Mercer called me with a voice I had never heard from him before. Tense. Careful. Victoria, he said. We just obtained access to a sealed filing. My heart didn't race. It didn't need to, because I already knew what he was going to say next would change everything. There's a full accounting report, he continued quietly. It shows the original trust value and every transaction made under your parents' control. I closed my eyes for a moment before asking the only question that mattered. How much was it? There was a pause. Then he said the number. And when I heard it, I finally understood why my family had been willing to erase me completely, because the amount wasn't in the hundreds of thousands. It wasn't even close. It was over $2 million. At 9:12 p.m. on a cold Thursday in early November, exactly 10 years after I was thrown out, I sat alone in my Chicago apartment and stared at a single PDF file that had just arrived in my inbox. The document was 47 pages long, stamped confidential court record, and it contained the one number that explained my entire past: $2,083,417.62. That was the original value of the trust created in my name after my grandfather's death. Not hundreds of thousands, over $2 million. And if you've ever wondered how far people will go when that kind of money is involved, tell me honestly in the comments. Do you believe money reveals who people truly are? Or does it transform them into someone else entirely? Because what I was about to read proved something chilling. My parents hadn't just taken advantage of a situation. They had engineered it. The report Daniel Mercer obtained was not emotional. It was brutally precise. Every line item, every transfer, every justification filed with the probate court. No opinions, just facts. I opened the document and started reading. Page 1 showed the trust creation date 12 years earlier. Beneficiary: Victoria Ann Hale. Primary guardians and trustees: Robert Hale and Elaine Hale. Initial allocation: $1.4 million invested in diversified long-term equities, $400,000 in government bonds, $283,417.62 held in liquid reserve. The structure was designed for growth, conservative but stable. By the time I turned 21, the projected value would have likely exceeded $3 million. That was the plan. Until I turned 16. Page 12 was where everything shifted. 6 months before I was thrown out, my father filed a petition requesting reallocation to mitigate market volatility. The court approved it. That reallocation sold large portions of the equity holdings, replacing them with short-term discretionary funds. The wording sounded responsible, but the result was devastating. Because those discretionary funds allowed for much easier withdrawals, I kept reading, and the pattern became unmistakable. Small withdrawals at first. $18,000 labeled educational planning expenses. $24,500 labeled legal consultation fees. $31,000 labeled guardian administrative compensation. Each one approved by the court. Each one technically legal, but together they were draining the core of the trust. Then I reached a section dated 3 days before my 17th birthday, the exact date on the bank statement I had memorized years earlier. That page contained the most chilling line in the entire document. Petition: expanded discretionary access due to beneficiaries' ongoing behavioral instability, and voluntary estrangement from guardians. I stared at those words because they weren't describing me. They were constructing a legal version of me, one designed to justify further control. That petition was approved 2 weeks after I was thrown out. And once it was approved, the withdrawals accelerated. $200,000 transferred into a guardian-managed investment vehicle. $350,000 reclassified as family asset protection restructuring. $500,000 moved into a private LLC controlled by my father. Every transaction had legal documentation. Every transfer followed procedure. But the intent was obvious. They weren't protecting the trust. They were relocating it from my name into theirs. By the time I reached the final accounting page, my hands were completely still. Not shaking, not trembling, just cold. The remaining balance when I turned 21 had been exactly $47,832. Less than 3% of the original value. And even that amount had been consumed by final administrative fees within 6 months. In legal terms, nothing had been stolen. Everything had been justified through court-approved petitions. But in reality, they had dismantled my financial future piece by piece. I closed the document and sat in silence, not angry, not crying, just absorbing the scale of what had been done. Because this wasn't impulsive greed. It was long-term strategy. Years of calculated paperwork. Years of narrative control. Years of ensuring I remained legally invisible. After a long time, I called Daniel. He answered immediately. "You saw it," he said quietly. Yes. There was a pause before I asked the question that mattered most. "Is any of this illegal?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said carefully, not directly. "They followed procedures. But what?" "But there is one vulnerability," he said. My heart slowed. Focused. "Several petitions relied heavily on sworn statements about your behavior and estrangement," he continued. "If those statements can be proven intentionally false, especially if they were used to obtain expanded financial control, it could constitute fraud upon the court." Fraud upon the court. That phrase landed heavily because it meant something critical. The case wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth. If I could prove they lied to the court about why I left, everything could change. Not just legally, publicly. Because fraud cases don't stay quiet. They become records, permanent ones. But there was one problem. Proving intent required evidence. And evidence meant witnesses. People who could confirm what really happened the night I was thrown out and what had been said afterward. I leaned back in my chair because suddenly memories surfaced. Neighbors, teachers, one particular person who had seen everything unfold that night. Someone who had tried to intervene. Someone I hadn't thought about in years. Marlene Porter. The diner waitress who had given me my first job. She hadn't just helped me survive. She had asked questions. Careful ones. Questions that suggested she already suspected something deeper. And I realized something that made my pulse steady with a quiet, dangerous certainty. Marlene hadn't just been kind. She had been observant. She had noticed things, possibly even documented them. Because people like her, people who had lived hard lives, didn't just witness injustice. They remembered it. And if she had kept any record of that night, any detail contradicting my parents' court statements, it could become the key that transformed a legal technicality into a full public exposure. I stared at the city lights outside my window, because for the first time in 10 years, the path forward was completely clear. Not revenge through confrontation, not emotional closure, but something far more precise. The slow dismantling of the narrative they had built, one verified fact at a time. And somewhere back in Ohio, there was a woman who might hold the single piece of evidence capable of breaking everything open. At 5:40 a.m. on a gray Sunday morning, exactly 10 years and 3 weeks after I was thrown out, I parked a black rental car across the street from the old diner in Dayton, Ohio, and turned off the engine without stepping out. I sat there for 47 minutes, watching the front door, knowing that once I walked inside, I wasn't just revisiting the past, I was about to turn it into evidence. If you've ever returned to the place where your life first broke apart, you know that strange feeling when everything looks smaller than your memories. Before I continue, tell me this. Would you go back to face the place that saw your worst moment? Or would you stay away forever? Because that morning, I didn't feel fear. I felt something far quieter. Control. The diner hadn't changed much. Same faded red sign. Same cracked parking lot lines. Same bell that chimed when the door opened. The only difference was me. 10 years earlier, I had walked through those doors with a trash bag and nowhere to sleep. Now, I stepped inside, wearing a tailored charcoal coat, carrying a leather folder, and holding more financial power than anyone in that building could guess. But none of that mattered in that moment, because I wasn't there to show success. I was there to retrieve truth. Marlene Porter was still behind the counter. Her hair was grayer, her posture slightly slower, but her eyes were exactly the same sharp, steady, observant. She looked up as the bell rang. For a second, she didn't react. Then recognition flickered across her face. Not surprise, not excitement, just a quiet, knowing nod. "Thought you might come back one day," she said. Her voice hadn't changed, still calm, still direct. I sat on the same stool I had used years earlier. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she poured coffee without asking. Black. Exactly how I used to drink it. "You look stable," she said finally. I almost smiled. That was the goal. She studied me for a long second before asking the only question that mattered. "Are you here to tell me you made it? Or to tell me you found out why you had to?" I placed the leather folder on the counter, slowly opened it, and slid the printed trust accounting report toward her. "I know what they did," I said quietly. She didn't pick up the pages right away. Instead, she looked at me and asked something unexpected. "Do you know what they told people after you left?" My chest tightened slightly, because I didn't. I had always assumed they stayed silent. But Marlene shook her head. "They didn't stay silent," she said. "They talked a lot." My voice was calm. "What did they say?" She exhaled slowly. "They told everyone you ran away because you were stealing from them, that you had emotional problems, that you refused therapy, that they tried everything." Each word landed like a cold confirmation, because that narrative matched exactly what had been filed in court. Behavioral instability, voluntary estrangement, unreachable minor. It wasn't just paperwork. It had been a public story, a consistent one. And that meant something crucial. They hadn't just lied legally. They had rehearsed the lie socially. I asked the next question carefully. Did anyone believe them? Marlene didn't hesitate. Some did. People believe parents by default. Then she paused. But not everyone. My heartbeat slowed, focused. Who didn't? She finally picked up the report pages. Skimmed them. Her eyes darkened as she understood what she was reading. Then she placed them down and said something that shifted everything. "The night they threw you out, your father came here." I froze, because that was not a detail I expected. "When?" I asked quietly. "About 2 hours after you arrived," she said. "Around midnight." That detail alone cracked open a new possibility. Because in court filings, my father had claimed he hadn't known where I went. He had described me as missing. But if he had come to the diner, he had known exactly where I was. Marlene continued. "He didn't come to check on you," she said flatly. "He came to make sure you didn't talk." My hands remained still on the counter, but inside, something sharpened. "What did he say?" She met my eyes directly. "He told me you were unstable, that you'd stolen money, that I shouldn't help you or let you stay here." That was already damning. But then she added quietly, "And he offered me $5,000 to tell anyone who asked that you left voluntarily." The air felt suddenly heavy, because that wasn't just narrative control. That was attempted witness manipulation. I asked the question carefully. "Did you accept it?" Her answer came instantly. "No." Then she stood, walked into the back office, and returned with a small metal box. She placed it on the counter between us. The lock clicked open. Inside were neatly organized envelopes, receipts, old notes, and one small audio recorder. "I've worked in this diner 32 years, she said. "You learn to document things when people try to rewrite reality." My pulse slowed into something steady and cold, because I already knew what she was about to say next. "I recorded that conversation," she said quietly. The world seemed to narrow to that one object on the counter, because that recording was not emotional evidence. It was legal evidence, direct, time-stamped, verifiable. Proof that my father knew where I was. Proof He tried to silence a witness, proof his court statements were false. I didn't reach for the recorder immediately. Instead, I asked one final question. Why did you keep you all these years? Marlene's answer was simple. Because I knew one day you might come back needing the truth more than you needed comfort. Silence settled between us. Not heavy, not painful, just complete. Because in that moment, the last missing piece fell into place. I wasn't alone in what happened. There had always been someone watching, someone refusing to accept the narrative, someone quietly preserving facts while I built my life elsewhere. I finally picked up the recorder, held it in my hand, and understood something with perfect clarity. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about exposure. Because once that recording entered legal proceedings, my parents wouldn't just face financial scrutiny. They would face something far more devastating. Public accountability. And as I placed the recorder carefully into my folder, one final thought settled into my mind with absolute certainty. They had spent 10 years believing their story was airtight, but they had made one fatal mistake. They assumed no one had been listening the night they erased me. At exactly 8 a.m. on a cold Monday morning, 3 weeks after I left the diner with Marlene's recorder in my bag, I walked into a downtown Chicago law firm, carrying a single hard drive that contained 10 years of silence and the one audio file that could dismantle an entire legal narrative. The meeting lasted 92 minutes, and when it ended, my attorney said something that made the air in the room feel sharper than before. This isn't just a civil matter anymore, he said. This has the potential to become a fraud investigation. If you've ever waited years for truth to finally align with proof, you know how quiet that moment feels. Before I continue, I want to ask you, do you believe real justice is loud and dramatic or slow and methodical? Because what came next wasn't explosive. It was precise, calculated, and impossible to undo. The law firm was called Whitaker and Bell, LLP, specialists in financial litigation and fiduciary misconduct. I had chosen them carefully because this wasn't about suing my parents for money. It was about exposing how they obtained court permissions in the first place. My lead attorney was named Rachel Whitaker. Full name, Rachel Lynn Whitaker. Early 40s, sharp voice, unemotional demeanor. Exactly the type of person who viewed truth as a system of documentation, not feelings. She listened to the audio recording with headphones, eyes closed, hands folded. When it finished, she didn't react immediately. She replayed one section, then another. Then she removed the headphones and spoke in a calm, clinical tone. "Your father states clearly that he knows where you are," she said. "He also attempts to influence a potential witness's testimony." She tapped the table lightly. "This directly contradicts sworn statements he submitted to probate court, claiming you were unreachable and that he made reasonable efforts to locate you." That contradiction was everything. Because fraud upon the court doesn't require stolen money. It requires intentional deception that influenced judicial decisions. And the recording showed exactly that. Rachel explained the legal path forward. Step 1. File a motion to unseal all trust management petitions and financial transfers. Step 2. Submit the recording as evidence of misrepresentation. Step 3. Request a formal court review of guardian conduct. If approved, the case could escalate into a full investigation. And that was when she said something that shifted the emotional weight of the situation. "Once this is filed," she said quietly, "your parents will not be able to keep this private." I nodded. Because that was precisely the point. I wasn't interested in negotiating quietly. I wasn't interested in settlement checks. I wanted the narrative corrected, publicly, permanently. Rachel leaned forward slightly. "There is one more factor you should consider," she added. "What?" "Public exposure can be unpredictable. Once this becomes record, media attention is possible. It will also affect your sister." I didn't react outwardly, but internally, that name still carried weight. Cassandra Hale. I hadn't spoken it out loud in years. Rachel continued. "She signed multiple affidavits supporting your parents' claims about your behavior." That detail settled heavily, because it meant Cassandra hadn't just accused me once. She had reinforced the narrative legally, repeatedly, which raised a question I had never fully answered. Had she been protecting our parents or protecting herself? I pushed that thought aside because emotions weren't relevant at this stage. Evidence was. Rachel outlined the timeline. Filing the motion would take 2 weeks. Court response could take 2 to 3 months. If approved, depositions would follow. And depositions meant something critical. My parents would be required to testify under oath again, this time with contradictory evidence already on record. Before leaving, Rachel asked one final question. Are you prepared for what this might reveal? I understood what she meant. Because once the sealed records were fully opened, I would see everything. Every transfer, every petition, every decision made behind closed doors. There would be no ambiguity left, only facts. I've been preparing for 10 years, I answered calmly. That was the truth. Because revenge had never been my goal. Clarity was. The motion was filed 12 days later. The language was precise. It focused entirely on procedural deception, not emotional harm, not family conflict. Just documented inconsistencies, because courts respond to facts, not stories. During the waiting period, I didn't contact anyone from my past. I didn't check social media. I didn't attempt to reach out to Cassandra. I simply continued working, maintaining routine, maintaining control. But something unexpected happened 6 weeks later. Rachel called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was calm, but there was a subtle tension underneath it. The court has granted the motion, she said. That meant everything would now be reviewed. But then she added something that shifted the stakes dramatically. There's another development. I sat still, listening. Your parents have already been notified, she said, and their attorney has responded. What did they say? There was a brief pause. Then Rachel answered carefully. They are claiming they were acting under advice from a third-party financial consultant. That detail introduced a new variable, because until that moment, I had believed this was entirely my parents' strategy. But now, there was someone else involved, someone who had guided them through legal structures, someone who understood trust law well enough to design the process. Rachel continued. They've submitted a name, she said, and this person appears repeatedly in financial filings connected to the trust. I asked quietly, who? She took a breath, then spoke the name that sent a cold, steady realization through my chest. Michael Davenport. I didn't recognize it immediately, but something about it felt familiar, like a memory just out of reach. Rachel added one final detail. He's a private financial advisor, she said. And according to records, he was already working with your family before the trust modifications began, which meant something crucial. The plan to restructure my trust hadn't been spontaneous. It had been professional, structured, designed, and somewhere in the past, there was a point where this advisor had first entered my parents' lives. A moment where a decision had been made, a decision that set everything into motion years before I was thrown out. As I hung up the phone, a quiet, dangerous clarity settled into my mind. Because now I understood something new. My parents hadn't just acted alone. They had been guided. And finding out who Michael Davenport really was would reveal exactly when my family stopped seeing me as a daughter and started seeing me as an asset. At 7:18 p.m. on a rainy Thursday night, I sat in my office overlooking the Chicago River and opened a 312-page investigative file labeled Davenport, Michael Edward, a document my legal team had compiled over the past 6 weeks. The first page contained one line that made everything inside me go completely still. Licensed fiduciary advisor, specializes in trust restructuring for family asset protection. If you've ever discovered that a betrayal wasn't impulsive, but professionally engineered, you know how cold that realization feels. Before I go further, I want to ask you this. Do you think people who design these systems believe they're helping families? Or do they simply see numbers instead of human lives? Because what I was about to learn made one thing painfully clear. My family hadn't just taken advantage of an opportunity. They had hired someone to create it. Michael Edward Davenport had built his career quietly. No flashy advertisements, no media presence, just decades of work inside private financial networks. His client list consisted almost entirely of upper-middle-class families managing inheritances, trusts, and estates. He was known for one specific skill: asset preservation under legal pressure, which sounded harmless until I read further. His specialty wasn't just protecting assets from lawsuits or taxes. It was repositioning funds when beneficiaries were considered high risk. High risk could mean many things: addiction, debt, legal trouble, or family conflict. In those cases, Davenport often recommended a strategy called protective restructuring. It involved legally shifting trust control into guardian-managed entities, supported by behavioral documentation. I stared at those words, because that was exactly what had happened to me. But the timeline was the most chilling part. Davenport had first been hired by my parents when I was 15, a full year before I was thrown out. That detail alone changed everything, because it meant the planning began long before any argument about stolen money, long before Cassandra accused me, long before the night I was erased. The plan had been in motion already. The next section of the file contained correspondence records, email summaries obtained through court disclosure. Most were heavily redacted, but certain phrases remained visible. One message from Davenport to my father read, "Given the beneficiary's increasing behavioral unpredictability, it would be prudent to document any incidents that could support future petitions for expanded discretionary authority." I read that sentence 3 times because it revealed the core strategy. They weren't reacting to my behavior. They were preparing to define it, creating a legal narrative in advance. Another message, dated 3 months later, contained a line that made my chest tighten. "Timing will be critical. Actions taken before the beneficiary reaches legal access age are essential to ensuring long-term asset protection." Timing, that word echoed, because suddenly, the night I was thrown out no longer looked like a spontaneous explosion. It looked like execution, a moment chosen carefully to trigger a sequence already planned. I leaned back in my chair, breathing slowly, not overwhelmed, just absorbing the full scale of what had been orchestrated. 10 years earlier, I thought I had been rejected emotionally. Now I understood something far colder. I had been removed operationally, like an obstacle. The final section of the file contained financial link analysis. It traced where the trust funds had ultimately gone. Some had been consumed through administrative fees. Some had been invested into my father's real estate LLC. But a significant portion, nearly $600,000, had been transferred into an investment fund managed directly by Davenport's firm, which meant something critical. He hadn't just advised. He had profited legally through management fees and performance commissions. But still, he had a financial incentive to recommend restructuring. Rachel Whitaker called me later that evening. Her voice carried a quiet intensity. "This changes the scope of the case," she said. "How?" I asked calmly. "It introduces the possibility of third-party fiduciary misconduct," she explained. If Davenport knowingly encouraged false documentation to obtain expanded control over the trust, he could be held liable, not just my parents, but the professional who guided them. That realization shifted something inside me, because for the first time, I saw the full structure of responsibility. My parents had chosen to follow the plan. Cassandra had reinforced the narrative. But Davenport had designed the system, Rachel continued. "There's more," she said. "He's requested to testify voluntarily." That caught my attention. "Why would he do that?" I asked. There was a pause before she answered. "Most likely to protect his professional reputation. He'll argue he relied entirely on information provided by your parents, which meant he would shift responsibility back to them. And under oath, that could force everyone to reveal details they had kept hidden for years." Rachel added one final piece of information. "The hearing has been scheduled," she said, "in 8 weeks. A public court proceeding, where sworn testimony would occur in front of a judge, legal representatives, and official records. It wouldn't be a dramatic confrontation. No shouting, no emotional scenes, just documentation, questions, and truth being placed on the record permanently." After we ended the call, I remained sitting in my office as the city lights reflected on the rain-streaked windows. Because now, after a decade of silence, the final phase had begun. Not revenge, not reconciliation, exposure. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think about one thing I had avoided for years. Cassandra. Because if she had known about Davenport, if she had participated in preparing documentation about my behavior, then her role had been far more than a single accusation on one night. She had been part of the process. But there was still one question I hadn't answered, one detail that the file didn't explain. What had my parents actually told Davenport about me in the beginning? What version of me had they presented to justify restructuring a multi-million-dollar trust? Because whatever they said had been convincing enough to start everything that followed. And in 8 weeks, under oath, that original narrative would finally be revealed, word for word, in a courtroom where it could no longer be hidden behind sealed documents. At 9:03 a.m. on a clear Tuesday morning in early spring, I walked into the Franklin County Probate Courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, carrying a thin black folder and wearing the same calm expression I had practiced for years. Outside, nearly 40 people were already gathered, legal observers, court staff, and a handful of local reporters who had quietly learned that a long-sealed fiduciary misconduct review was about to become public record. If you've ever imagined confronting people who once erased you, you might picture shouting, tears, or dramatic speeches. But the truth is much colder. Before we continue, I want to ask you this. Do you think real justice feels satisfying in the moment, or does it feel strangely quiet? Because when I stepped into that courtroom, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. No dramatic lighting, no grand stage, just rows of wooden benches, fluorescent lights, and a judge's elevated desk at the front. It wasn't built for emotional closure. It was built for documentation. I sat at the petitioner's table beside Rachel Whitaker. Across the room, at the respondent's table, sat Robert Hale and Elaine Hale, my parents. For the first time in 10 years, I saw them in person. They looked older, smaller somehow. My father's shoulders had rounded. My mother's hair was more gray than brown, but their expressions were exactly the same. Controlled, defensive, carefully neutral. They didn't look at me. Not once. Cassandra Hale sat beside them, her posture straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. She avoided eye contact, too. Not coldly, not arrogantly, almost anxiously. The final seat at their table was occupied by a man I recognized from the file. Michael Edward Davenport. Neatly dressed, calm, professional. He looked like someone attending a routine financial review, which to him, this probably was. But to me, this was the moment where a decade of narrative would finally be tested against facts. The judge entered promptly at 9:15 a.m. Judge Mary Ann Keller. Known for her strict adherence to procedural clarity, she wasted no time on introductions. This proceeding concerns a motion to review fiduciary conduct in the management of a trust established for Victoria Ann Hale, she stated calmly. Her voice was steady, impersonal, exactly as it should be. Rachel began with a simple outline. No emotional language, no accusations, just a timeline supported by documents, trust creation, guardian petitions, financial reallocations. Then she presented the key issue. Sworn statements submitted by Robert and Elaine Hale, claiming I had voluntarily estranged myself and could not be located. She paused, then said quietly, "We will demonstrate that these statements were materially false." That was when the room became completely silent. Because in legal settings, words like materially false carry enormous weight. Rachel called the first piece of evidence, the audio recording. It was played through courtroom speakers. My father's voice filled the room, calm, firm, unmistakable. He stated clearly that he knew where I was, that I had not disappeared, and that he wanted to ensure I did not speak to others. Every word contradicted his sworn filings. As the recording ended, no one moved. The silence felt heavier than any argument. The judge turned toward my father. "Mr. Hale," she said evenly, "do you dispute that this is your voice?" He hesitated, then answered quietly, "No." That single admission shifted everything. Because once authenticity was confirmed, the contradiction became undeniable. Rachel continued methodically. She presented court filings side by side with the recording transcript, demonstrating precise inconsistencies, not emotional, not exaggerated, just factual. Then came the next phase. Witness testimony. Marlene Porter entered the courtroom calmly. She explained her role, her interaction with my father, her documentation practices, her refusal of the $5,000 payment. She spoke clearly, without anger, without embellishment. And that made her testimony even more powerful. Because credibility in court is built on restraint, not emotion. My father's attorney attempted to challenge her memory, but she had written notes dated from that night. Time-stamped, consistent, reliable. The narrative of my voluntary disappearance collapsed quietly under the weight of documented facts. Then came the moment everyone had been anticipating. Michael Davenport's testimony. He took the stand calmly, swore his oath, and began explaining his role. "I provided financial guidance based on information presented by the guardians," he said. Rachel's questioning was precise. "Were you aware that the beneficiary had not actually disappeared?" "No." "Were you aware that attempts were made to influence witnesses regarding her circumstances?" "No." "Would such knowledge have affected your recommendations?" "Yes." That exchange shifted responsibility directly back to my parents. Because Davenport's defense depended entirely on their truthfulness, Rachel then presented the email correspondence, including the message advising documentation of my behavioral instability. She asked one final question. "Did you verify the accuracy of those behavioral claims independently?" Davenport hesitated, then answered, "Number. Fiduciary advisors rely on guardian representations." That admission established something critical. The entire restructuring process had been built on unverified statements provided by my parents, which meant if those statements were proven false, every subsequent petition based on them could be legally invalidated. The judge leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "This court will take these matters under review," she said. "The integrity of fiduciary proceedings depends on truthful representations. Any intentional misrepresentation will have serious consequences." The hearing ended without dramatic confrontation. No shouting, no emotional speeches, just facts placed permanently into the legal record. As people began to leave, I remained seated for a moment, breathing steadily, because this wasn't the end. It was only the exposure phase. The actual legal consequences would come later, quietly, through rulings, through orders, through official documentation that could never be erased. As I finally stood to leave, something unexpected happened. Cassandra spoke softly. "For the first time in 10 years, Victoria." Her voice trembled slightly. I turned toward her. She looked directly at me, eyes filled with something I hadn't anticipated. Not hostility, not arrogance, fear. And she said one sentence that revealed a truth I had never considered. I didn't know how far it would go. That statement hung in the air between us, because it suggested something crucial. She hadn't just participated. She had misunderstood the scale of what was happening, which meant there was still one layer of truth left to uncover. Not about the money, not about the legal process, but about the moment this entire plan had truly begun. Because somewhere in the past, there had been a conversation, a decision point, a moment when my parents first chose strategy over their own daughter. And Cassandra had been there when it happened. At 4:26 p.m. on a quiet Thursday, exactly 9 days after the court hearing, I sat across from Cassandra Hale in a small conference room inside Rachel Whitaker's office. Between us lay a single yellow legal pad, a recorder placed openly on the table, and one agreement already signed. Her voluntary statement would be entered into the official case record within 72 hours. If you've ever waited years to hear the truth from someone who once betrayed you, you might imagine anger rising when the moment finally arrives. But what I felt sitting there was something colder, a need for clarity, not confrontation. Before I continue, tell me honestly in the comments, do you think people who hurt us knowingly are worse, or those who convince themselves they're doing the right thing? Because what Cassandra was about to say fell somewhere in between. She looked different than I remembered. Not physically, she still had the same controlled posture, the same careful tone. But there was something else now. No certainty, no superiority, just exhaustion. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low. "I never thought you'd come back like this," she said. I didn't respond, because this wasn't a personal conversation. It was testimony. Rachel pressed the record button. "Please state your full name for the record," she said. "Cassandra Elaine Hale." Rachel nodded. "Miss Hale, you requested this meeting voluntarily. You understand this statement may be used in court proceedings?" "Yes." There was a brief silence. Then Cassandra looked directly at me, for the first time in years. And she said something that shifted the entire narrative. The plan didn't start with the money, she said quietly. It started with fear. That sentence settled into the room heavily, because it contradicted everything I had believed for a decade. I thought the trust money had been the motive from the beginning. But Cassandra shook her head slowly. Mom and Dad didn't even know how large the trust was at first, she explained. They just knew it existed. I felt something tighten inside my chest, because that meant there was another factor. Another reason they began working with Michael Davenport. Rachel leaned forward slightly. What triggered their initial concern? She asked calmly. Cassandra hesitated, then answered, Your college acceptance letter. I blinked once. Not from emotion, from confusion, because that detail had nothing to do with money. But Cassandra continued. You got into Northwestern, she said. Full academic scholarship, early acceptance. A memory surfaced instantly. The letter I had opened at the kitchen table when I was 16. The excitement, the disbelief, the way my parents had reacted. Quietly, too quietly. Cassandra's voice trembled slightly. That was when Dad first contacted Davenport, she said. I asked the question slowly. Why would my college acceptance scare them? Her answer came after a long pause. Because Davenport explained something to them. What? That once you turned 18 and began managing your own financial records, you would eventually discover the trust. The air felt suddenly heavier, because now the timeline made complete sense. My acceptance letter hadn't just represented opportunity, it represented independence, access. The moment when I would become legally capable of reviewing documents connected to my name, Cassandra continued. They weren't planning to take everything, she said. At first, they just wanted flexibility. Flexibility, that word, felt painfully inadequate. But it revealed something critical. The initial intent may not have been full removal. It had escalated gradually, like most moral compromises do. Rachel asked carefully, What changed? Cassandra swallowed. Her voice dropped even lower. The market crash that year, she said. Suddenly, another memory aligned. That period when news constantly reported economic instability, investments dropping, families losing savings, Cassandra explained. Dad panicked. He thought if they didn't gain full control over the trust quickly, market losses could reduce its value. So fear had triggered the first steps, not greed. Fear of losing something they believed they needed to protect. But then she added quietly, and once the restructuring started, they realized how much money was actually there. There it was, the turning point. Because fear might start a process, but discovery of massive financial value changes motivations. Cassandra's eyes filled with tears she didn't wipe away. That was when everything shifted, she said. I didn't speak. I just listened. Because this was the final layer of truth. Not legal, not financial. Human. They started talking about it differently, she continued. Not as your future, but as the family's security. That phrase felt like a quiet blade. Family security. Meaning my existence had become a variable in their financial calculations. Rachel asked the final question. The night Victoria was expelled from the home, was it spontaneous? Cassandra closed her eyes briefly, then answered, no. Silence filled the room, because that single word confirmed everything. It had been discussed for weeks, she said softly. They believed that if you left voluntarily after a documented conflict, it would justify expanded trust control. There it was, the final truth. The argument about $1,200. The slap, the expulsion. All of it had been the execution phase of a plan that began with fear and ended with opportunity. Rachel turned off the recorder. The statement was complete. Legally, permanently. Cassandra looked at me again. I never thought it would go that far, she whispered. I finally spoke. My voice calm. Even. You knew enough to stay silent. She nodded slowly, because that was true. Silence had been her participation, not planning, not executing, but allowing. I stood up. The conversation was over, not emotionally, but factually. As I walked toward the door, Cassandra spoke one last time. There's something else you don't know. I paused, turned back slightly. What? Her voice shook. Mom and Dad never used most of the money for themselves. That statement stopped me completely, because it contradicted everything the financial records suggested. What do you mean? I asked. She took a slow breath. They moved a large portion into something they never disclosed in the filings. A hidden transfer, not visible in the official accounting, which meant there was still one final secret. One last truth that hadn't surfaced yet. And whatever it was, it explained why my parents had continued fighting so hard to keep everything sealed, even after their narrative had already collapsed. At 6:12 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning, nearly 11 years after I walked away from my parents' house with a trash bag and nowhere to go, I stood alone at the edge of Lake Michigan, holding a single envelope that had arrived 2 days earlier. Inside was a court order, stamped and finalized, confirming what the legal system had now established in permanent record. My parents had committed fraud upon the court, not emotional betrayal, not family conflict. Fraud. If you've ever waited years for truth to finally be recognized, not by people, but by systems that cannot be argued with, you know how strangely calm that moment feels. Before I finish this story, I want to ask you something. Do you believe closure comes from winning, or from finally understanding everything that happened? Because for me, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like stillness. The court's final ruling had taken 3 months after the hearing. It was detailed, clinical, unemotional, just like the process that led to it. The judge determined that Robert Hale and Elaine Hale had knowingly submitted false statements to obtain expanded discretionary control over my trust. Those false representations invalidated multiple petitions. And because those petitions directly enabled the restructuring of funds, they constituted fiduciary misconduct and fraud upon the court. The consequences were severe, but precise. They were ordered to repay a substantial portion of the misappropriated trust assets, approximately $1.3 million, based on recoverable transfers. Their remaining real estate holdings were placed under court-supervised liquidation to fulfill restitution. Michael Davenport's firm faced regulatory sanctions for failing to verify guardian claims before recommending restructuring. His professional license was suspended pending further review. And Cassandra, she was not charged. Her voluntary testimony, combined with lack of direct financial involvement, positioned her legally as a cooperating witness rather than a participant. Everything had unfolded exactly as the legal system was designed to handle it. Quietly, methodically, irreversibly. But the final piece of truth, the one Cassandra mentioned, came from a separate disclosure filed at the very end of the proceedings. It revealed where a large portion of the trust money had ultimately gone. Not into luxury purchases, not into hidden personal accounts, but into something far more complicated. Nearly $800,000 had been transferred into a long-term medical fund, a fund established in my mother's name, for a condition she had been diagnosed with shortly before my acceptance letter arrived: early-onset neurodegenerative disease, a condition that would eventually require extensive long-term care. That was the fear Cassandra had described. Not losing money, losing stability, facing a future of overwhelming medical costs. When I read that part of the court file, I finally understood the full picture. The original motive hadn't been greed. It had been panic, fear of illness, fear of losing control, fear of being financially unprepared. But somewhere along the way, that fear had transformed into justification, and justification had become rationalization, until I was no longer seen as a daughter, only as access. Understanding that didn't excuse what they did, but it completed the truth. Months after the ruling, I visited them once, not out of obligation, not for reconciliation, just for clarity. They lived in a smaller apartment now. Their former house sold to satisfy restitution orders. My father looked older than I remembered. My mother? Quieter, more fragile. There was no confrontation, no accusations, just a brief conversation that ended with one sentence I had prepared carefully. "I don't hate you," I told them calmly, "but I will never allow you back into my life." That was the boundary. Clear, permanent, necessary. Cassandra and I never rebuilt a relationship, but we reached an understanding. Occasional, brief messages, neutral updates, nothing more. Because some connections cannot be restored, only acknowledged. As for me, I never used the restitution money for personal luxury. Instead, I created something that felt balanced. A financial education foundation for teenagers aging out of unstable homes. Young people who, like I once had, were navigating survival without guidance. Every year, dozens of them now receive scholarships, financial literacy training, and legal support. Not charity, preparation. Because the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's independence. It's building a life so stable that no one can ever manipulate your future again. Sometimes, early in the morning, I still think about that night when I sat on the curb at 16 years old, cold, alone, waiting for someone to come back and tell me it had all been a mistake. No one ever did. But now I understand something I didn't know then. That moment wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I stepped outside a narrative someone else had written for me and began writing my own. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, tell me in the comments, do you believe people can truly heal after family betrayal? Or do we simply learn to live with it differently? And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe, because next time, I want to tell you about another woman whose revenge didn't involve courts or money at all, but a secret she kept hidden for 22 years.